Hello and welcome to Sleep Tales. Tonight, we invite you to leave your day behind and join us for a quiet story, a gentle journey designed to help you rest. There is nothing for you to do now but listen. Find a comfortable position, close your eyes if you feel ready, and allow your mind to follow the sound of my voice. We are going for a walk, a slow and peaceful walk through the streets of an ancient city. Let the story unfold at its own pace, and let your thoughts drift with it towards a deep and untroubled sleep. Chapter 1: The Fountain of the Turtles. The sun, an old and familiar acquaintance in the vast Roman sky, had begun its slow, deliberate descent towards the horizon. Its light, no longer the sharp, almost clinical white of midday, had softened into a rich, viscous gold. It was a light that seemed to possess both substance and warmth, a liquid honey that poured through the tall, open window of Arthur's apartment. It did not simply illuminate the room, it filled it. The light created a single, perfect rectangle of warmth on the dark, polished wooden floor, a geometric shape of pure afternoon that seemed more solid than the air around it. Within this bright column, a silent universe of dust motes performed an endless, swirling ballet. Arthur sat in his worn leather armchair, a piece of furniture that had molded itself to the shape of his body over decades, and he watched them. He watched these tiny, glittering specks, each a minuscule planet on its own unknowable trajectory, catching the light for a brilliant instant before disappearing back into the relative dark. They moved without sound, without purpose, simply existing within the flow of the air. He thought of them as a kind of clock, a silent and random clock that measured nothing but the immediate passing moment. It was time made visible, but it was time without order, without the reassuring, predictable beat that he had dedicated his entire life to creating. His hands, two loyal instruments that for 50 years had navigated the miniature, intricate worlds inside of timepieces, rested now upon his knees. They were still, they were empty. For half a century, these hands had known the cool, smooth feel of brass and steel, the delicate resistance of a tiny screw turning in its thread, the almost weightless tension of a hairspring being coaxed into place. His fingertips held the memory of 1,000 different textures, the rough surface of an unpolished gear, the slickness of fine oil, the sharp edge of a newly cut cog. These hands had held time itself, had assembled the very engines that gave it a voice. Now they did nothing. They simply lay in his lap, the web of wrinkles and veins a testament to a lifetime of meticulous work, their purpose now unclear. The silence in the apartment was profound. It was not a peaceful silence, not the gentle quiet that used to be the backdrop to his life. Before, silence had been the space between things, the space between the chiming of the hour, the space between his wife Maria's soft humming as she read, the space between their easy, comfortable words. This new silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence in itself. It was a thick, heavy blanket that seemed to absorb all potential noise. It was the silence of a stopped heart, the silence of 100 clocks all wound down at once. He was not overcome with the sharp pain of grief. That had been a storm that had passed, leaving this strange, quiet stillness in its wake. He felt adrift, a ship whose sails had been taken down, floating on a vast and placid sea with no land in sight. A thought, or rather a feeling, rose slowly from within him. It was not a command, not an urgent need, but a gentle, persistent suggestion from the deepest parts of his being. He needed to move. He needed to feel the solid ground beneath his feet, to feel the gentle friction of shoe leather against stone. He needed to reconnect with the rhythm of the world outside his quiet room, to feel the great, ancient heart of Rome beating. A rhythm that had persisted through emperors and popes, through triumph and ruin. While the clock of his own small life had paused, the city's clock ticked on, eternal and steady. He would go for a walk. He formed no destination in his mind, no map, no plan. The purpose was the walking itself. He would let the afternoon be his guide. He would let the maze of streets choose his path. With a soft groan from both his own joints and the old leather of the chair, he pushed himself to his feet. The rectangle of sunlight on the floor had shifted slightly, a slow, silent movement that marked the passage of time more reliably than any clock in the room. He walked to the wooden hook by the door and took down his simple, dark gray jacket. It was soft and familiar, a comfortable shell. He slipped his small, worn leather wallet into the inner pocket. It contained very little, just a few bills and his identification, but its presence was a comforting, familiar weight. He opened his front door, closing it softly behind him, and stepped from the profound silence of his apartment into the gentle, ambient quiet of the building. The air in the grand stairwell was cool and still, carrying the faint, clean scent of old stone and perhaps a hint of beeswax from a neighbor's polished furniture. His footsteps, which had been absorbed by the wooden floors and rugs of his home, now found a voice. Each step on the marble staircase was a soft, distinct echo, a single, clear note in the stairwell's quiet acoustics. He descended the 3 flights slowly, his right hand resting on the smooth, cool metal of the ornate railing. He looked down at the steps as he went. They were made of a pale, creamy marble, veined with threads of gray. In the center of each step, a shallow depression had been worn away, a gentle, concave curve sculpted not by a chisel, but by the accumulated pressure of a century of footsteps. Generations of people coming and going, ascending with hope or descending with weariness, each one contributing an invisible, infinitesimal layer of erosion to the stone. He thought of it as a kind of public memory, a story told not in words, but in worn marble. He reached the ground floor and faced the building's massive front door. He pushed the heavy brass handle, and the door swung open with a soft, deep creak. He stepped out onto the narrow sidewalk, and the city enveloped him. The light was brighter here, the air warmer and full of life. It was not a loud or overwhelming welcome. Far in the distance was the constant, low hum of traffic, a sound so ubiquitous in Rome that it became a kind of silence, the baseline upon which all other sounds were laid. Much closer, he heard the cheerful, rhythmic clatter of plates and forks from the small trattoria directly across the street. Its outdoor tables were a cascade of white and red checkered tablecloths, a scene of simple, everyday pleasure. From one of those tables, he could hear the animated rise and fall of a conversation in Italian, a language that to his ears always sounded like music, full of passion and melody, even when he could not grasp the meaning. A scooter suddenly zipped past, its high-pitched whine a sharp, fleeting line drawn through the afternoon's soundscape. It turned a corner and was gone, and its sound was immediately absorbed back into the city's gentle, constant hum. He began to walk, his feet shod in simple, comfortable leather shoes, found the familiar, uneven rhythm of the San Petrini, the small, square cobblestones that formed the skin of old Rome. Each stone was a block of dark basalt, its top surface worn smooth and shiny by centuries of rain, cartwheels, and countless footsteps. They were not laid in a perfect, flat grid. They formed a textured, living surface, a mosaic of slight dips and rises that demanded a certain mindful attention from a walker. It was impossible to stride thoughtlessly over such a street. You had to engage with it, to feel it through the soles of your shoes. He let his body guide him, turning left down a street that was more of a canyon than a thoroughfare, carved deep between tall, imposing buildings. The buildings were painted in the classic Roman palette: faded ochre, burnt sienna, and shades of pale, dusty yellow. They rose up so high and stood so close together that they seemed to be leaning in towards each other, their tiled roofs nearly touching 5 stories above, leaving only a thin, meandering ribbon of deep blue sky visible. High above, balconies were small gardens hanging in the air. They overflowed with a chaotic abundance of green plants, their leaves reaching for the sunlight. He saw the brilliant, almost defiant red of geraniums blooming in simple clay pots. He saw long, delicate tendrils of ivy creeping down the weathered plaster walls, their tiny roots finding invisible purchase in the smallest cracks and fissures. It was a testament to the persistence of life, finding a way to thrive even on the vertical face of the city. He walked past a darkened doorway, an archway that led into a hidden courtyard. It was a smell that bypassed thought and spoke directly to a primal part of his soul, a scent of comfort, of home, of simple sustenance. He paused for a moment and breathed it in deeply, a small, private act of pleasure. He was not thinking of his wife. He was not thinking of his work. He was simply being. He had become a quiet collector of details. He noticed a heavy, ornate door knocker made of iron, fashioned into the fierce face of a lion. He noticed the intricate, swirling pattern of a wrought iron grate covering a ground floor window, a design that was both a beautiful object and a stern declaration of security. He saw a single, perfect white feather from a gull or a pigeon resting on a stone windowsill, a tiny, weightless thing of delicate beauty in a city built of stone and weight. His pace was slow, meditative. There was no destination, and therefore no need for hurry. For him, time was no longer a commodity to be managed or a race to be won. It had become a vast flowing river, and he was content to be a piece of driftwood, carried along by its gentle, inexorable current. He let the busy life of the city flow around him. A family with 2 small, laughing children bustled past him. A young couple, their fingers intertwined, strolled by, lost in their own private world. A small group of tourists stood on a corner, consulting a large paper map, their heads tilted up in wonder at the height of the buildings. He was invisible to them, just a quiet old man in a gray jacket. Another part of the scenery, a native figure moving through his natural habitat. He felt no desire to be noticed. He was happy to be a shadow, an observer at the edge of the frame. After walking for some time, perhaps 15 minutes, perhaps 20, he had no way of knowing. He let his feet guide him down one narrow, winding alley and then another. The logic of these streets was not the logic of a grid, but the organic, twisting logic of a riverbed. Then he felt a subtle change in the atmosphere around him. The enclosed feeling of the narrow street began to dissipate. The air seemed to open up, and a new sound began to filter through the ambient hum of the city. It was a sound he had not even realized his soul was thirsty for. It was the sound of falling water. It was not a roar or a crash, but a gentle, continuous, and complex music. It was a sound of life, of movement, of coolness. He followed it as a lost traveler follows the sound of a river. The narrow alley suddenly gave way, opening into a small, secluded, and utterly peaceful square. He had arrived, the Piazza Motai, and there, in its heart, holding the entire space in its gentle liquid spell, was the fountain of the turtles. He stopped at the edge of the small piazza, allowing himself a moment to simply absorb the scene before him. The square was not a perfect rectangle or circle, but an irregular shape, defined by the elegant, time-worn facades of the old palazzos that enclosed it on all sides. The light here was different. It was soft and indirect, having filtered down between the tall buildings. It was a quiet light. The dominant presence in the square, both visually and audibly, was the fountain. Its constant, soothing music of splashing, gurgling, and trickling filled the air, washing away the distant hum of the city traffic. It was an oasis of profound and sudden peace, a secret garden of stone and water hidden in plain sight. He walked slowly, deliberately towards the fountain, his soft-soled shoes making no sound on the cobblestones. He found a spot on the low, wide stone ledge that formed the outer basin of the fountain. He ran his hand over the stone before he sat. It was warm, having stored the afternoon sunlight like a battery. He sat down, placing his still empty hands on his knees, and he began to watch. He did not immediately try to analyze the fountain's structure or recall its history. He started with a single sense. He started with listening. He closed his eyes for a moment to better focus on the sound. He began to dissect the fountain's music. It was not a single sound, but a chord made up of many different notes. There was the clear, bell-like splash as the main streams of water fell from the upper basin into the larger bowl below. This was the melody. Beneath that, there was a lower, more complex gurgling sound as the water in the basin churned and moved, flowing towards the outlets. This was the harmony. And then there were the subtler sounds, the high, soft, almost hissing trickle of individual droplets running down the bronze skin of the statues, and the gentle patter of the fine mist settling on the surface of the water. He could feel a deep, low vibration through the stone he was sitting on, the thrumming of the pump hidden somewhere in the fountain's heart. He imagined each sound as a different section of an orchestra. The splashing streams were the violins, the gurgling basin was the cellos, the trickling droplets were the piccolos. Together, they played a simple, beautiful, and endless symphony. He opened his eyes and turned his attention to the water itself. It was remarkably clear. In the large lower basin, the water was a deep pool of cool, placid green in the shaded parts. He could see the bottom clearly, and on it lay a scattering of coins, mostly copper, but a few silver ones too, shining dully in the submerged light. They were small, silent wishes, offerings left by strangers. The surface of the water was a canvas of constant motion. Where the streams hit the pool, they created a burst of white foam and a pattern of concentric ripples that expanded outwards, intersecting with other ripples, creating a complex, shimmering, and ever-changing geometric design. In the parts of the fountain that were still touched by the direct sun, the surface of the water glittered with a blinding intensity, throwing off thousands of tiny, brilliant flashes of light, like scattered diamonds. A fine, cool mist rose from the splashing water, and when the gentle breeze shifted, he could feel it on his face and hands, a refreshing and welcome sensation. He thought about the water's long journey, its cycle. It came from some distant, unseen source, an ancient aqueduct buried deep beneath the modern city. It traveled through a hidden network of pipes, finally to emerge here, in this piazza, to perform its beautiful, temporary dance in the sunlight. And then it would drain away, rejoining the city's hidden waterways, continuing its endless journey. The water was always new, always moving, always changing. Yet the fountain, the beautiful vessel that gave the water its form and its purpose, was always here, constant and unchanging. Having immersed himself in the experience of the water, his focus now broadened to the structure that contained it. He looked at the fountain as a complete object, a work of art. It was a masterpiece of grace and charm. It was not a monument built to overwhelm or to proclaim power, like so many of Rome's other fountains. It did not roar, it whispered. It was intimate, personal, and full of a gentle, playful spirit. The materials themselves were a study in contrast. The basins and the central pedestal were carved from a pale, grayish marble, which looked soft and almost chalky in the afternoon light. The living figures of the fountain, however, were cast in a dark, rich bronze, weathered by centuries to a deep, complex patina of green and black. The cool, static elegance of the marble provided the stage for the warm, dynamic life of the bronze figures. He let his eyes travel up the structure, focusing now on the 4 bronze figures of the young men, the ephebs. One foot was planted firmly on the stone base, while the other rested with impossible lightness on the head of a bronze dolphin. Their bodies were slender and athletic, the bodies of youths on the cusp of manhood. The sculptor had captured them in a moment of fluid motion, not a stiff, formal pose. They seemed relaxed, their limbs elegantly arranged. Their arms were raised, reaching up towards the rim of the upper basin, their hands poised to act. Arthur, the craftsman, the man who understood the difficulty of making inert materials appear alive, felt a deep sense of professional admiration. To cast a figure in heavy molten bronze that could convey such lightness, such suppleness, was the work of a true master. He studied the turn of a wrist, the gentle curve of a spine, the subtle tension in a thigh muscle. It was all perfect. He then looked at their faces. They were faces of classical beauty, serene and calm, with the faintest hint of a smile playing on their lips. It was an enigmatic smile, one that gave away no secrets. They had been standing here, holding this exact pose for over 400 years, watching the world change around them, while they remained eternally young, eternally graceful. They were a perfect, fleeting moment of youth, captured and made permanent. His gaze followed the line of their slender, raised arms up to the scalloped edge of the top basin. And there, at the culmination of the fountain's upward-reaching energy, were the turtles. There were 4 of them, one for each young man. They were the detail that gave the fountain its name, its story, and its soul. Each turtle was depicted at the precise moment of clambering over the marble rim, its journey seemingly aided by the gentle push of the young man's hand. They were small, but rendered with an astonishing, loving detail. He could almost count the individual scutes on their domed shells. He could see the wrinkled, leathery texture of the skin on their outstretched necks. He could see the determined, slightly anxious look in their tiny bronze eyes. They were so full of life, so convincingly rendered, that he felt they might, at any moment, complete their struggle and splash satisfyingly into the cool water of the basin. He knew the famous story behind the turtles. They were not part of the original design. For 50 years, the fountain had stood with the young men's hands resting on the rim, their purpose unclear. Then, a later artist, perhaps the great Gian Lorenzo Bernini himself, had added these 4 small bronze creatures. It was an act of artistic genius, an inspired afterthought that transformed the entire work. The turtles provided the missing piece of the story. They explained what the young men were doing. They were not just posing, they were helping. It was a small, charming narrative of cooperation between man and animal. The turtles created a visual and thematic link between the lower and upper parts of the fountain, guiding the viewer's eye upwards and completing the circle of motion. He loved this idea that a masterpiece was not necessarily created in a single, perfect flash of inspiration, but could evolve, could be perfected over time. It felt like a quiet conversation between 2 great artists, separated by half a century. The turtles were the final perfect word in that conversation. They represented a small, simple act of kindness, a gentle push, a helping hand, and this act had been immortalized, made eternal in bronze. He allowed his eyes to drift back down to the base, to the dolphins upon whose heads the young men stood. They were not realistic dolphins, they were creatures of myth and fantasy. Their bodies were sleek and curved in an impossibly elegant arc, and their tails, instead of ending in a simple fluke, were twisted into elaborate, decorative swirls, like something from an illuminated manuscript. Their mouths were open, and from them, elegant streams of water arched outwards, falling into large, carved marble shells below. They were the foundation of the fountain's magic, creatures from a forgotten, dreamlike sea, now brought to the center of a city to play their part in this beautiful, watery spectacle. Arthur leaned forward and trailed his fingers in the cool water of the lowest basin. It felt clean and refreshing. He thought again about his clocks. His entire professional life had been a quest for precision, an effort to tame the wild, formless river of time by building intricate, unyielding dams of gears and springs. His clocks were designed to resist deviation, to be impervious to the chaos of the world. They were beautiful in their logic, their predictability, their control. This fountain, he realized more deeply now, was the complete opposite. It was a clock that celebrated chaos, that embraced imperfection. Its ticking was the random splash of water. Its hands were the ever-shifting patterns of light and shadow. It did not measure the minutes of a human life, but the slow, deep, geologic time of the earth. It measured time in the gradual erosion of its marble edges, in the slow darkening of its bronze patina, in the seasonal cycle of the moss that grew in its damp crevices. It was a clock that was not about human control, but about patient, graceful endurance. And looking at it, feeling its ancient, steady pulse, Arthur felt a profound sense of peace. The anxious need for his own life to have a clear, ticking purpose began to recede. It was enough, perhaps, just to endure, to be a quiet witness to the flow of things. The knot of tension he had carried in his chest for months began to loosen, to dissolve in the fountain's gentle music. Chapter 2: The Weight of Layers. The sun had continued its unhurried journey across the sky, and the quality of the light in the small piazza had changed once more. The golden warmth was beginning to be tinged with the softer, rosier hues of late afternoon. The shadows, once sharp and distinct, were now growing longer and softer at the edges. Arthur felt a gentle internal nudge. The moment at the fountain felt complete. He had drunk deeply from its well of peace, and now it was time to move on, to continue his aimless pilgrimage through the city. He pushed himself up from the warm stone ledge, his legs feeling a little stiff, a quiet reminder of his age and the time he had spent in stillness. He gave the fountain one last, lingering look, a silent nod of gratitude to the graceful bronze boys and their determined turtle companions. Then he turned, leaving the piazza and its liquid music behind him, though he carried the feeling of its peace with him, a cool stone in his pocket. He chose a narrow street leading away from the piazza, one he had not taken before. The transition was immediate. He left the open, light-filled space of the square and was once again plunged into the cool, shadowed world of Rome's ancient alleys. The air here was cooler, the sounds more muffled and intimate. He was walking into the heart of what was once the Jewish ghetto, a neighborhood dense with history and sorrow, but also with an incredible resilience. He did not think consciously of the area's tragic past, but he could feel the weight of centuries in the very stones around him. The buildings seemed to lean in even closer here, their walls telling stories of lives lived in close quarters, of a community bound together by faith and necessity. His attention was drawn to the walls themselves. They were not smooth, uniform surfaces. They were complex tapestries of time, patchworks of different eras built, one on top of the other. He saw a rough, dark wall made of tufa, a volcanic stone used by the ancient Romans, and embedded within it, like a fossil, was a single, elegant block of white marble, probably scavenged from a ruined temple centuries ago. A little further on, he saw the unmistakable arch of a medieval doorway, now bricked up, its original purpose lost to time, existing now only as a decorative scar on a Renaissance-era wall. The city, he thought, was like a living organism that was constantly consuming and repurposing itself. Nothing was ever truly thrown away. Every stone had a story, a previous life. He followed the winding street as it opened onto a larger, more chaotic space, a place where the layers of time were not just visible, but were shouting at him from every direction. He had arrived at the portico of Octavia. It was a place that always made him feel a profound sense of vertigo, not a physical dizziness, but a temporal one. Here, the present and the deep past collided with a dramatic and beautiful lack of ceremony. He stopped and stood still, letting his eyes try to make sense of the scene. Before him stood the remains of a monumental ancient gateway. A few towering marble columns, their tops crowned with intricate Corinthian capitals, still supported a fragment of the original structure. The inscription on the stone was still partially legible, a ghostly message from an emperor to his people 2,000 years ago. The marble was stained and weathered, chipped and cracked, but its dignity was intact. It was a ruin, but it was a magnificent ruin. And then, woven directly into this ancient Roman structure, was a medieval church. The wall of the church used the ancient columns as its foundation. A simple, arched Christian doorway was cut directly next to the grand pagan gateway. A window with a cross was set into a wall that had once been part of a temple dedicated to Jupiter. It was a breathtaking collision of worlds, of belief systems, of architectures. It was not a careful, museum-like preservation. It was a practical, messy, and deeply human reuse of space. The people of the Middle Ages had not seen this place as a sacred relic to be preserved behind a rope. They had seen it as a source of good, strong building materials, a convenient and solid foundation upon which to build their own world. Arthur walked closer, his hand reaching out to touch one of the giant columns. The marble felt cool and surprisingly smooth, worn down by 20 centuries of wind and rain. He tried to imagine what this place must have looked like in its prime, a vast, glittering public space full of libraries, temples, and art, bustling with Roman citizens in their white togas. The thought was too vast, too difficult to truly grasp. The past was a ghost, and he could only see its faint outline in the stones that remained. He then looked at the medieval church built into its side. He imagined the people who had worshipped their lives so different from the Romans who had come before them, yet they walked on the same stones, under the same sky. He let his gaze wander from the portico to the structure that stood nearby, one that always struck him with a particular sense of wonder, the Theater of Marcellus. From a distance, it looked like a smaller, more compact version of the Colosseum, a grand curving facade of stone arches stacked 3 stories high. It was a place built for spectacle, for thousands of people to gather and watch plays and performances. But as he looked closer, he saw the most remarkable thing. The top layer of the ancient theater was not a ruin, it was a building. A Renaissance palazzo with regular rectangular windows, shuttered and closed, had been built directly on top of the ancient arches. And inside those arches on the lower levels, he could see signs of modern life. There were windows with flower boxes, a glimpse of a curtain, the dark shape of a satellite dish. People lived here. People had apartments inside an ancient Roman theater. They washed their dishes, watched television, and went to sleep every night inside a structure that was built by the Emperor Augustus before the time of Christ. This, to Arthur, was the most profound expression of Rome's character. The city did not place its history behind glass. It lived in it, breathed it, used it as its home. He imagined what it must be like to wake up in the morning and look out of your window from an apartment built into the Theater of Marcellus. Your view would be of other ancient ruins, and your foundation would be the work of Roman engineers. It was a continuity of life that was almost overwhelming to contemplate. He thought about the layers, the Roman foundation, the medieval fortress that the theater had become after the fall of the empire, the Renaissance palace built on top of that, and now the modern apartments with their electricity and plumbing, layer upon layer upon layer. Each era had not erased the one before it, but had simply built on top of it, creating a complex, messy, and beautiful whole. He started to walk again, his path taking him alongside the curving wall of the theater. He ran his hand along the massive blocks of travertine that formed the lower arches. The stone was rough and pitted, a stark contrast to the smooth marble of the portico. Each block was enormous, a testament to the ambition and engineering skill of its builders. He peered into the darkness of one of the lower arches, which was now used as a kind of storage space, filled with discarded furniture and old wooden crates. Even in its current humble state, the arch had a sense of grandeur, its perfect curve a marvel of geometry and physics. He thought about the concept of layers in his own life. His life too was built on top of the foundations of the past. His childhood, his apprenticeship as a clockmaker, his marriage to Maria, his years of patient work, his friendships, his joys, his sorrows, they were all layers. The person he was today was not a separate entity from the young boy who had first marveled at the inside of a watch. He was the accumulation of all those past selves, all those past experiences. The memories were the stones, the foundations of his current reality. Some of those foundations were now ruins, like the memory of his wife's laughter, a beautiful structure that he could see but no longer inhabit. Yet, he was still living on top of that foundation. Like the city itself, he was a complex accumulation of time. As he walked, the smells of the neighborhood filled his senses. From a nearby restaurant, the rich, savory scent of garlic and olive oil being heated in a pan drifted out. A smell that was so fundamentally Italian, so full of life and appetite. It mingled with the fainter, dustier smell of the old stones and the green, slightly damp scent of moss and weeds growing in the cracks between them. He heard the sounds of the living city intertwined with the silence of the ruins. He heard the chatter of a group of school children on a field trip, their high, excited voices a sharp contrast to the deep, ancient silence of the theater. He heard the rumble of a bus passing on the nearby road, its modern sound a reminder of the relentless forward march of time. He came to a small, open area next to the theater, where a number of cats were lounging in the afternoon sun. They were the famous cats of Rome, semi-wild creatures that lived amongst the ruins as if they were their natural habitat. They were a part of the city's ecosystem. He saw a sleek black cat asleep on top of a fallen marble capitol, its body perfectly fitted to the carved shape of the ancient acanthus leaves. Another, a fluffy orange cat, was meticulously washing its paw, sitting on a patch of sun-warmed grass that grew where the floor of a Roman house had once been. They seemed to be the true inheritors of this ancient place, living their simple, elegant lives with a quiet dignity, utterly unimpressed by the monumental history that surrounded them. They were creatures of the present moment, and they seemed to understand the art of finding a comfortable place in the sun, an art that Arthur was only just beginning to learn himself. He watched them for a while, admiring their grace and their profound indifference. They were the keepers of the ruins, the small, warm-blooded souls that gave life to the cold stone. He continued his walk, moving away from the theater of Marcellus and deeper into the narrow streets. The sense of layered time was everywhere. He looked up at a simple, plaster-walled apartment building and saw about halfway up its wall a single, beautifully carved marble head protruding from the plaster. It was the head of a Roman god or nobleman, a fragment from a statue, now serving as a strange and wonderful piece of decoration on an otherwise unremarkable building. Someone, centuries ago, had found this piece of carved stone and had decided to incorporate it into their home. Why, perhaps as a sign of good luck, perhaps simply because it was beautiful. It was another example of the city's refusal to let its past die, its insistence on weaving the old threads into the new fabric. He thought about his work, A clock is a machine designed to erase the past. Its hands move forward, and each moment, once past, is gone forever, replaced by the next. A clock's purpose is to show only the present. It has no memory. The city of Rome, he mused, was the opposite of a clock. It was a machine designed to accumulate the past. Nothing was ever fully erased. The old layers were always visible, pushing up through the surface of the present. The city's memory was long, and its face was scarred with the evidence of everything it had seen. Walking through it was like being inside the mechanism of a vast, complex timepiece, but one whose hands moved so slowly that a human lifetime was barely a single tick. The sun was lower now, and the shadows of the buildings had stretched across the narrow streets, making them cooler and darker. The sliver of sky visible above had deepened in color, from a bright blue to a more intense, violet-tinged hue. The air was growing cooler. He felt a sense of satisfaction, a feeling of having understood something, though he could not have put it into words. He had felt the sheer physical weight of time. He had seen how the past was not a distant, abstract concept, but a tangible presence, a foundation, a shelter. He felt his own small story, his own layers of memory, fitting into this much larger narrative. He was a single, weathered stone in a wall made of countless stones. He was a part of the great, layered accumulation. Chapter 3. The Gentle Ascent. Having absorbed the profound lesson of the city's layers, Arthur found himself at the foot of a grand ascent. It was not a steep, challenging flight of stairs, but a wide, gentle, and majestic ramp known as the Coordinata. It was the main approach to the Capitoline Hill, a place that had been the symbolic and political heart of ancient Rome. Arthur knew this was a path designed by the great Michelangelo, and it felt less like a simple staircase and more like a work of art in itself, a piece of architectural theater designed to create a specific feeling in those who walked it. It was an invitation to climb, an encouragement to rise above the bustling city below and enter a space of order and grandeur. He felt a quiet pull towards it. His journey so far had been on the level ground through the dense and tangled history of the lower city. Now it was time to change his perspective, to gain some height, to see things from a different angle. He began the climb. The first thing he noticed was the sheer width of the ramp. It was enormous, wide enough for a dozen people to walk side by side. The steps themselves were not steps in the usual sense. They were very low, long, and shallow, more like wide, gently sloping platforms separated by a single low riser. This unique design had a purpose. It was made not just for men on foot, but for men on horseback. A nobleman could ride his horse all the way to the top of the hill without the animal ever struggling. This thought pleased Arthur. It was a design of thoughtful and democratic elegance, welcoming to all, whether on 2 feet or 4. The effect of these shallow steps on his own body was immediate. The climb felt effortless. It did not require the huffing and puffing of a normal staircase. It was a slow, processional, almost meditative ascent. Each step was a long, deliberate stride, a moment to pause and feel the solid ground before taking the next. He focused on the physical sensation of the climb. With each step, his body rose just a few inches. It was a gradual, almost imperceptible gain in altitude. He could feel the slight shift in the work his muscles were doing, From the easy rhythm of walking on flat ground to the gentle, sustained effort of climbing, he paid attention to his breathing, keeping it slow and even. He was not in a hurry. The destination of this part of his journey was not the top of the hill, it was the hill itself. The experience of the ascent was the point. He let other people, mostly tourists eager to reach the famous piazza at the top, pass him by. They moved with a hurried energy, their cameras clicking, their voices full of excitement. Arthur moved at the pace of an old man, a pace that allowed for observation, a pace that matched the monumental stillness of the stone around him. He looked at the material beneath his feet. The ramp was paved with dark, weathered bricks, laid out in an intricate herringbone pattern. The low risers of the steps were made of the same travertine stone he had seen elsewhere, its pockmarked surface a testament to its age. The stone was worn, especially in the center of the ramp, where millions of footsteps had smoothed its surface to a gentle shine. He ran his hand along the wide, solid balustrade that flanked the staircase. It was also made of massive blocks of travertine, cool and solid under his palm. The sheer scale of it, the immense weight and solidity of the stone, gave him a feeling of security, of permanence. This was a structure built to last, a pathway designed to endure for eternity. As he slowly climbed, his view of the city below began to change. With each step, more of the world revealed itself. The tangled rooftops he had just walked beneath began to resolve into a clearer pattern. The tops of buildings that had been hidden from view now appeared. The perspective shifted subtly, from being inside the maze to being just above it. It was a satisfying feeling, like solving a small piece of a puzzle. He could see the tops of distant umbrella pines, their distinctive flat shapes like green clouds floating above the sea of terracotta tiles. The sounds of the city also changed. The specific, close-up sounds of the street, the chatter, the footsteps, the clatter of the trattoria began to fade, replaced by a more generalized, distant hum. His attention was drawn to the two enormous statues that stood at the base of the Cortinata, one on each side, like silent, eternal guards. They were ancient Roman statues of the twin demigods, Castor and Pollux, each one standing beside his horse. They were colossal, carved from white marble that had been stained and weathered to a soft gray by the centuries. The figures of the men were powerful and heroic, their bodies idealized and muscular. The horses beside them were massive, their necks arched, their nostrils flared, full of a powerful, restrained energy. They were representations of untamed natural force being controlled by human will. Arthur stood for a moment, looking up at them. They had been moved here by Michelangelo from another part of the city to be the grand starting point of his new design. They were another layer of history, ancient Roman art repurposed to adorn a Renaissance vision. They set the tone for the entire climb. This was a place of power, of history, of myth. He continued his ascent. He noticed how the light played on the surface of the ramp. Since he was facing west, the direction of the setting sun, the light was directly in front of him. But it was filtered through the buildings and trees at the top of the hill. It created long, dramatic shadows that stretched down the ramp towards him. His own shadow was a long, thin, dark figure walking ahead of him, a silent companion on his journey. The air itself seemed to be full of a golden, dusty light, the same light he had seen in his apartment, but now it felt vast and open. He thought about the man who had designed this path, Michelangelo. He was an artist known for his passionate, almost violent energy, for the immense struggle depicted in his sculptures and paintings. Yet, this staircase was a work of profound calm, of gentle and effortless grace. It was a work of an old, wise master who understood not just drama, but also tranquility. It was designed to lift the spirit as it lifted the body. Arthur, a craftsman himself, felt a deep sense of connection to that idea. He had spent his life working with his hands to create things of order and beauty. He understood the deep satisfaction of taking raw materials, wood, metal, glass, and shaping them according to a precise and thoughtful plan. Michelangelo had taken a whole hillside, a chaotic piece of nature, and had imposed upon it a design of perfect, harmonious, and humane logic. As he neared the top of the ramp, 2 more statues came into view, flanking the final steps. These were not ancient Roman originals. They were Renaissance copies, but they carried the same classical spirit. They were trophies of war, pieces of ancient Roman armor and weaponry piled high, symbols of victory and power. They marked the transition from the city of the people below to the seat of power above. He was entering a space that was meant to impress, to communicate authority. He had reached the top. The piazza was not a square, but a trapezoid, a clever trick of perspective by Michelangelo to make the space feel even more harmonious and balanced. It was paved with a stunning, intricate pattern of interlocking ovals and diamonds, radiating out from a central point like a star. The pattern itself seemed to hum with a silent, geometric energy. The piazza was enclosed on 3 sides by magnificent palaces, also designed by Michelangelo to create a single, unified architectural vision. Their facades were a symphony of pale travertine, with grand columns, elegant windows, and classical statues looking down from the rooftops. The color of the stone, a warm, creamy white, glowed in the late afternoon sun. In the center of the piazza stood a magnificent bronze statue, a powerful figure on a majestic horse. It was the great Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, his arm outstretched in a gesture of peace and authority. He had been sitting on his horse in the center of this piazza for centuries, the calm, philosophical emperor at the heart of his city. This was a space of pure reason, of perfect symmetry, of human intellect imposing a sublime order on the world. It was a man-made world, a stage set for grand events. He felt the contrast deeply. He had journeyed from the messy, lived-in reality of the city, with its smells and its sounds and its crumbling walls, to this high, clean, and perfect space of pure idea. He had climbed from the world of the body to the world of the mind. He had started with simple clocks, learning the basic mechanics, and had slowly, over many years, climbed towards mastery, creating more and more complex and beautiful timepieces. His life had been a coordinata of dedication, a slow and steady path towards a kind of perfection in his work. And now, here he was, at the top. He was retired. He had reached the piazza of his old age, and what did he find here? A quiet, open space, a place for reflection, a place with a commanding view. The piazza was busy with people. Tourists were gathered around the statue of Marcus Aurelius, taking pictures. A wedding party was spilling out of the central building, the city hall, the bride and groom smiling, surrounded by their joyful family. Arthur watched them for a moment, a small, poignant scene of new beginnings taking place in this ancient setting. The city was always a stage for these human dramas, large and small, his footsteps feeling small and insignificant on the vast geometric design. He bypassed the main entrance to the central palace and walked around to the right side, to a lesser-known terrace that looked out over the back of the hill. This was his destination. This was the reason for his gentle ascent. He reached the stone balustrade at the edge of the terrace and looked down, and there it was. The view, the heart of ancient Rome, laid out before him like a map of time itself. The climb was over. Now it was time to simply see. Chapter 4. The View Over Time. It felt like an anchor, a firm point of contact with the world before he looked out upon the view. For a moment, he did not look down. He looked straight ahead at the hazy blue shapes of the distant Alban hills, their outlines soft against the pale sky. He took a slow, deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool, dry air of the hilltop. Then, slowly, he lowered his gaze, that it seemed to steal the air from his lungs for a second time. It was not a pretty landscape. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking, and magnificent wound. Before him, stretching out in a wide, sunken valley, lay the ruins of the Roman Forum. It was a landscape of brokenness, a vast and silent city of ghosts. From his high vantage point, he could see the entire expanse, from the foot of the Capitoline Hill where he stood, all the way to the distant, hulking shape of the Colosseum. The late afternoon sun, now low in the western sky behind him, streamed over his shoulder and bathed the entire scene in a light that was almost magical. It was a deep, liquid gold, the color of old honey, a light that seemed to mourn and celebrate at the same time. It smoothed the harsh edges of the broken stones and filled the empty spaces with a soft, melancholic glow. Every standing column, every fragment of a wall, cast a long, impossibly sharp shadow that stretched across the uneven ground, a second, darker ruin lying beside the real one. He stood there for a long time, his hands gripping the cool stone, simply trying to take it all in. It was too much to comprehend at once. It was a visual overload of history. It was like looking at a geological map, but instead of layers of rock, it showed layers of human civilization, all compressed and jumbled together. He saw the skeletal remains of great temples, the crumbling arches of vast public basilicas, the faint outlines of ancient roads, and the scattered, chaotic debris of 1,000 fallen statues and buildings. It was the heart of an empire, dissected and laid bare for all to see. He decided to let his eyes wander, to not force a narrative, but to simply see what was there, to let the details come to him one by one. His gaze first settled on the structure closest to him, at the foot of the hill, now weathered to a mottled gray and brown, as if the stone itself was bruised by time. It had 3 passageways, a large central arch and 2 smaller ones on either side. He could see that its entire surface was covered in intricate carvings, detailed reliefs depicting Roman victories in distant lands. From his vantage point, he could not make out the individual figures, the soldiers and the chariots, but he could see the texture they created, a rich, complex pattern that caught the golden light in 1,000 different ways. The top of the arch was a jumble of ruined stonework, a place where weeds and small hardy bushes had taken root. their green leaves a startling sign of life on the dead stone. The long shadow of the Capitoline Hill was creeping across its base, slowly swallowing the monument in darkness, while its upper portions still blazed with a brilliant, almost holy light. He thought of all the people who had passed through those arches, victorious generals and their armies, emperors in their grand processions, ordinary citizens going about their daily business. For centuries, this arch had been a symbol of absolute power and permanence, and now it stood silent and empty, a grand but lonely gateway to nowhere. It was a large rectangular box with a simple roof. Its survival was a miracle. It had been converted into a church in the Middle Ages, which had protected it from being dismantled for its materials. He looked at its unadorned brick walls, glowing a deep, warm red in the afternoon sun. He imagined the great debates that had taken place within those walls, the fiery speeches of orators, the secret political dealings, the decisions that had shaped the course of Western civilization. All that immense energy, all those powerful voices, were now reduced to this silent, empty brick box. The contrast between the building's simple form and its monumental history was staggering. He could see the large bronze doors at its entrance, dark and imposing. He knew they were replicas. The originals had been moved to a church centuries ago. More layers, more recycling of history. The main road that cut through the heart of the Forum. He imagined it paved with smooth, chariot-worn flagstones, crowded with people. He could almost hear the echo of their footsteps, the murmur of their voices, the sounds of a vibrant city. Now, there were only a few tourists wandering along its path, small, brightly colored figures moving slowly through the vast emptiness. They looked like explorers on the surface of a dead planet. They held up nothing but the sky. Their marble was fluted with delicate vertical grooves that caught the light and shadow, giving them a sense of texture and grace. He admired their defiant posture. They had lost their temple, their roof, their god, but they still stood, a testament to the beauty of what had once been. They were a perfect image of noble ruin. He thought about the enormous treasury of the Roman Empire that had been housed within that temple. All that gold, all that wealth was long gone, melted down, stolen, scattered across the world. Only these 8 columns remained, silent witnesses to unimaginable riches. It was the Temple of Vesta, one of the most sacred sites in ancient Rome. It was here that the Vestal Virgins, a sisterhood of priestesses, had tended the sacred flame of the city, a flame that was never allowed to go out. As long as the flame burned, Rome was safe. Arthur looked at the empty circle of stone. The flame had been extinguished more than 1,500 years ago, and Rome had fallen. And yet, Rome had also endured. It had changed, it had crumbled, but it had not vanished. The city's heart had not stopped beating. It had just moved to a different place. The sacredness of this spot was gone, replaced by a quiet, historical curiosity. He could see the layout of the rooms, the central courtyard with its empty ponds, the rows of bases where statues of the head priestesses had once stood. He imagined the quiet, cloistered life of the women who had lived here, their lives dedicated to a single, solemn duty. It must have been a place of deep peace and order, an island of feminine tranquility in the midst of the bustling, masculine city. Now it was a place of deep silence, its secrets known only to the shade of the pine trees and the cats that sometimes slept on its warm stones. The sun was sinking lower, and the shadows were stretching even further, like long, dark fingers reaching across the forum. The air was becoming cooler, and a gentle breeze whispered past him, carrying the faint, dry scent of dust and old stone, and the distant, sweet smell of the pine trees on the hill. He tightened his grip on the balustrade, feeling its cool, solid reality as a grounding force against the overwhelming tide of history before him. He lifted his gaze and looked towards the far end of the forum. His eyes were drawn to a structure so massive it seemed impossible. 3 enormous coffered arches, like the arches of a giant buried aqueduct, rose from the ground. They were the remains of the Basilica of Maxentus and Constantine. It had been the largest building in the Forum, a colossal public hall used for law courts and business transactions. What he was seeing was only 1/3 of the original building. The rest had collapsed in an earthquake centuries ago. But even this one surviving fragment was enough to convey a sense of awe-inspiring scale. The arches were huge, cavernous, big enough to drive a modern building through. He could see the intricate, square coffered patterns on the inside of the arched ceilings, a detail of geometric beauty on a structure of brute force. He tried to imagine the complete building, its vast, vaulted roof, its floors of polished marble, its colossal statue of the Emperor Constantine, whose giant marble head and hand were now in the museum just behind him. The sheer ambition of the builders was hard to fathom. They built not for a human lifespan, but for an eternity. And yet, even their eternity had crumbled. Slightly to the right of the basilica, standing alone and framed by the sky, was another triumphal arch, the Arch of Titus. It was smaller and simpler than the Arch of Septimius Severus, but it was perfectly proportioned, a single, elegant archway. It was famous for the reliefs on its inside panels, which depicted the Roman soldiers carrying away the spoils from the temple in Jerusalem. It was a monument to a great and terrible victory, a celebration of conquest and destruction. He thought about the 2 arches, one at each end of the forum. They were like bookends to the story of the empire, monuments to its military power, the foundation of its wealth and its glory. And finally, beyond the Arch of Titus, rising up against the now purpling sky, was the unmistakable, iconic silhouette of the Colosseum. It dominated the landscape, the final, dramatic punctuation mark at the end of the forum's long, rambling sentence. Arthur let out a slow breath he did not realize he had been holding. He had looked at the individual pieces. Now he tried to see it again as a whole, a valley of memory, a landscape of absence. Everything was defined by what was missing. The missing roofs, the missing walls, the missing statues, the missing people. And yet, the absence was so powerful, it felt like a presence. The ghosts of the past were so thick in the air that they felt more real than the few living tourists walking among them. He thought about time. His clocks measured time as a steady, forward-moving line, a river flowing in one direction. Each second was identical to the one before it, but the time he was looking at now was not a line. It was a jumble, a chaotic landscape. Time here was a destructive force. It was the force that toppled columns, crumbled walls, and turned marble to dust. It was a force of decay, of entropy, of forgetting. But it was also a force of revelation. As the buildings fell, they revealed the foundations beneath them. As the layers of dirt were cleared away, older and older worlds were exposed. Time here did not just erase, it also uncovered. He felt his own life, his own personal history, in the context of this immense vista. His 60-some years, which had felt like such a long time, now seemed like a mere flicker, tragic and beautiful symphony of human loss that had been playing in this valley for millennia. The thought was not diminishing, it was comforting. It connected him to all the other lives that had been lived and lost here. He was not alone in his sorrow. He was just the most recent participant in an ancient human ritual. The weight on his chest seemed to lift, not to disappear, but to spread out, to become less concentrated, to dissipate into the golden air. He found a profound peace in the ruin. There was no pressure to be perfect, to be whole. The world before him was a testament to the beauty of imperfection, of survival, of endurance. These stones were not beautiful in spite of being broken. He thought of his own life, his own heart. It was also a landscape with its own ruins, its own missing pieces. And perhaps that was okay. Perhaps that was just the nature of things. He stayed at the balustrade, unmoving, for a very long time. He watched as the sun finally sank below the horizon behind him. The golden light faded, replaced by the soft, shadowless light of twilight. The colors of the forum changed. The warm reds and oranges of the stone cooled to shades of purple and deep blue. The lights of the modern city began to flicker on around the edges of the ancient valley, creating a new artificial constellation. The ruins became dark, hulking shapes, their details lost to the gathering night. The show was over. The Museum of Time was closing for the day. Arthur felt a sense of deep, quiet completion. He had climbed the hill. He had seen the view, and the view had seen him. He felt calmer, clearer, and lighter than he had in a very long time. He was ready to descend. Chapter 5. The last vestiges of color had faded from the sky, leaving behind a deep, star-dusted indigo. The air on the hilltop had grown noticeably cooler, carrying the first hint of the night's chill. A profound quiet had settled over the piazza, a stillness that felt both ancient and immediate. The grand historical vista of the Forum was now a dark, sleeping valley of shadows. The moment of deep contemplation was over, and he felt a gentle but clear pull to return to the world of the living, to descend from this high, solitary place of thought and rejoin the gentle, warm pulse of the city below. He felt no sense of anticlimax, no sadness at leaving the magnificent view behind. He felt a quiet sense of resolution, as if he had found a piece of a puzzle he did not even know he was looking for. He turned his back on the sleeping ruins and walked across the now almost empty piazza. The intricate star pattern on the pavement was barely visible in the dim light cast by the lamps on the surrounding palaces. The great bronze emperor, Marcus Aurelius, was a dark, hulking silhouette at the center of the vast, quiet space. Arthur chose not to descend by the same grand coordinata he had climbed. That path had been for the ascent, for the ceremonial journey upwards. For his return, he wanted something different, something more intimate and less theatrical. He walked towards the side of the hill, away from the main staircase, and found a smaller, steeper, and more winding set of steps that he knew would lead him down towards the river. The descent was a completely different experience from the climb. The steps were narrow and uneven, made of worn, simple stone, and they switched back and forth sharply as they followed the natural contour of the hill. He had to pay more attention to his footing, to place his feet with care. He held onto the simple iron railing for support. This path was not a grand public statement. It was a humble, practical way down, a servant's staircase compared to the master's ramp. As he descended, the grand open perspective of the hilltop quickly vanished, and he was once again enveloped by the city, enclosed by high walls and the backs of old buildings. The distant, panoramic view of history was replaced by the close-up, intimate details of the present. The focus of his senses shifted dramatically. On the hilltop, his experience had been almost purely visual, a grand spectacle for the eyes. Here, on this narrow, winding path, his other senses came alive. The air, which had been thin and cool at the top, now felt thicker, carrying a rich tapestry of smells. He could smell the damp earth from a small, overgrown garden clinging to the side of the hill. He could smell the sharp, pleasant scent of pine needles from a nearby tree. And as he got lower, he began to smell the unmistakable, delicious aromas of evening cooking drifting from the open windows of the apartments he was passing. He smelled roasting garlic, the rich scent of a tomato sauce simmering, and the faint, yeasty smell of baking bread. These were the smells of life, of nourishment, of home. They were simple, comforting, and deeply human. The sounds of the city also returned, not as a distant hum, but as a collection of specific, close-up sounds. He heard the clatter of a pot in a kitchen. He was no longer an observer, looking down upon a grand historical stage. He was now walking through the backstage corridors of the living city, amidst the quiet, ordinary drama of daily life. The path leveled out, and he found himself on a narrow cobblestone street, lit by the warm yellow glow of old-fashioned street lamps. The light pooled on the uneven stones, creating a beautiful pattern of light and shadow. The buildings on either side were tall and residential, their facades a patchwork of faded paint and weathered plaster. He was now in a world of intimate detail. He looked up and saw a row of laundry hanging from a line strung between two windows, the simple white shirts and sheets glowing softly in the lamplight, stirred by a gentle breeze. It was a humble and beautiful sight, a sign of the endless, necessary cycles of domestic life. He walked slowly, with no destination still, just following the gentle downward slope of the street. He looked into the windows he passed. Most were covered by shutters or curtains, offering only a tantalizing glimpse of the warm light within. But one ground floor window was open. He glanced inside as he passed. He saw a small room with a simple wooden table. An old woman was sitting at the table, her hands busy with some kind of needlework, her head bent in concentration under the light of a single lamp. It was a quiet, peaceful, and utterly self-contained scene, a painting by an old master come to life. He felt a sense of connection to her, another quiet soul going about her evening tasks. He was an anonymous stranger passing her window, and she was an anonymous woman in her home. Yet, for a fleeting second, their two quiet worlds had touched. He continued his walk, his senses fully awake to the small wonders of the neighborhood. He noticed a sleeping cat, a beautiful tabby with white paws, curled up on the warm stone ledge of a low wall. It was a perfect circle of contentment, its body rising and falling with the slow rhythm of its breath, completely oblivious to the world around it. Arthur smiled. The cats of Rome, he thought, were the true masters of the city. They understood its secrets. They knew how to find the warmest, most comfortable, most peaceful spots. He felt a kinship with this small, sleeping creature. He, too, was seeking a kind of quiet comfort, a peaceful place to rest his soul. He passed a small, ancient church, its doors closed for the night. A single lamp illuminated the stone carving above the doorway, depicting a saint with a gentle, sorrowful face. The church was dark and silent, but its presence gave the small street a sense of quiet sanctity. He noticed a small fountain set into a niche in a wall, not a grand monument like the one in the piazza, but a simple, functional source of water. It was a stone face, a weathered, mythical creature, with a steady stream of clean water pouring from its open mouth into a small stone basin below. The sound of the running water was a surprise on this quiet street, a soft, liquid music that was both refreshing and calming. He stopped for a moment and listened to it, a private concert just for him. He thought about the contrast between this experience and his time on the Capitoline Hill. The hill had been about the past, about the grand, sweeping narrative of history, about emperors and empires. This walk, this descent, was about the present. It was about the smell of cooking, the sight of laundry, the sound of a family talking, the peace of a sleeping cat. The history on the hill was magnificent, but it was also dead. This neighborhood was alive. It was messy, imperfect, and full of the quiet, beautiful, and ongoing business of living. He felt a shift in his own feelings. The profound, almost overwhelming sense of historical perspective he had felt on the hill was now being balanced by a feeling of gentle. He felt a quiet warmth spreading through his chest, a simple feeling of contentment. The street he was on began to widen slightly, and he saw more people. A couple walked past him, their arms linked, their heads close together as they talked in low voices. A man walked his small, scruffy dog, the dog's nails making a soft clicking sound on the cobblestones. The atmosphere was peaceful, unhurried. This was not the Rome of the tourists, of the grand monuments and the crowded attractions. This was the Rome of the Romans, the quiet, residential heart of the city. He noticed the details of the doorways he passed. Some were grand, with heavy wooden doors and carved stone surrounds. Each doorway was a portal to a hidden world, a private life, a family's story. He wondered about the people who lived behind these doors. He did not need to know their stories. It was enough to know that they were there, living their lives, contributing their own small thread to the vast, complex tapestry of the city. The air was fragrant with the smell of flowers. He looked up and saw that many of the balconies and windowsills were crowded with pots of geraniums, jasmine, and other night-blooming plants. The scent of the jasmine was particularly strong, a sweet, intoxicating perfume that hung in the still air. It was a smell he associated with summer evenings, with peace, with Maria. She had loved the smell of jasmine and had always kept a small pot of it on their own balcony. The memory came to him without sadness, without a sharp pang of loss. It was just a gentle, sweet thought, like the scent of the flower itself. It was another layer, another part of his own history, and it felt at home here, in this quiet, memory-filled street. He had been walking for some time, and he realized that the downward slope had ended. He was on level ground again. He could hear a new sound in the distance, a sound different from the city's traffic hum. It was a deeper sound, a steady, rushing sound. He knew what it was. It was the river. His aimless wandering had brought him, as if by some unconscious design, to the banks of the Tiber. He continued to walk towards the sound, a sense of quiet anticipation growing within him. His journey through the living city was leading him to the city's great, living artery. The descent was complete. He was back at the heart of things, but a different kind of heart, a heart of flowing water, of timeless movement. He was ready for the final chapter of his afternoon's walk, a chapter of quiet rest and observation by the ancient river. Chapter 6. The Flow of the River. His slow, contemplative walk through the quiet residential streets had led him, as if by an invisible current, towards a new and more dominant sound. It was the deep, steady, rushing whisper of the river. The narrow streets opened up, and he found himself standing on the Lungo Tavir, the wide road that runs along the high stone embankments of the Tiber. The change in atmosphere was instant and total. He had left the enclosed, intimate world of the neighborhood alleys and stepped into a vast open space, defined by the wide expanse of the river on one side and the endless flow of traffic on the other. The sky, which had been a narrow ribbon above the streets, was now a huge open canopy, stretching from horizon to horizon. He crossed the busy road with care, his senses adjusting to the new scale of his surroundings. He reached the heavy stone parapet that lined the river's edge and leaned against it, looking out over the water. The Tiber was not a beautiful river in the conventional sense. It was not sparkling or blue. It was a slow, powerful, and ancient creature, its water a murky, opaque green-brown, heavy with the silt and the secrets of the land it had traveled through. It moved not with a sprightly energy, but with a deep, slow, and inexorable force. It was a river that felt its own weight, its own age. On either side, it was contained by immense, towering walls of travertine, built by engineers in the late 19th century to tame its notorious floods. These walls were like cliffs, descending deep into the water, their stone faces stained dark with age and moisture. He began to walk along the wide pedestrian path that ran beside the parapet, heading in the direction of a nearby island he could see just ahead. It was the Isella Tiberina Tiber Island, a small, ship-shaped piece of land that had been a center for healing and worship since before the time of ancient Rome. It was connected to the riverbanks by 2 old stone bridges. The site of the island, with its cluster of buildings and its thick growth of trees, gave the river a focal point, a sense of place. He found what he was looking for: a simple stone bench set into a small alcove in the parapet. It faced the water, offering a perfect, unobstructed view of the island and the western sky. He sat down. The stone of the bench was cool, and he could feel the faint, deep vibration of the traffic passing on the road behind him. But it was a distant, ignoble hum. His attention was completely captured by the scene before him. The sun, which had been hidden behind the buildings on the hill, was now visible again. A great, fiery orange ball, hanging low in the sky, just above the distant line of rooftops on the far side of the river. The final, most spectacular act of the day's performance was about to begin. He sat and watched. He watched the surface of the slow-moving water. It was a vast, rippling canvas, and the setting sun was beginning to paint upon it. A long, glittering path of brilliant orange light stretched from the far bank all the way to where he sat, a road of molten gold laid across the green-brown water. The rest of the river was a patchwork of subtle colors. In some places, it reflected the pale blue of the upper sky. In others, it was a deep, shadowy green. The gentle current created slow, languid eddies and swirls, patterns that formed and dissolved with a hypnotic rhythm. The sky itself was transforming. The pale blue directly overhead was deepening into a rich, saturated cobalt. Lower down, near the horizon where the sun was, the colors were breathtaking. There were streaks of brilliant, fiery orange, soft washes of delicate pink, and deep, dramatic bands of magenta and crimson. The colors seemed to be alive, shifting and blending with an infinite subtlety. He watched a single, small cloud drift into the heart of the colors, its edges catching fire, turning into a piece of burning gold fleece. He watched the light on the buildings. The old ochre-colored apartment buildings on the far bank seemed to be glowing from within, their walls saturated with a warm, rosy light. Their windows, which had been dark squares just a short while ago, were now brilliant, blinding flashes of gold. As each pane of glass caught the direct rays of the setting sun and reflected them back at him, it was as if 1,000 small fires had been lit all at once across the river. On Tiber Island, the ancient stone tower of a church was transformed. The weathered gray stone turned a soft, warm pink, and the cross at its very top was a stark black silhouette against the brilliant, burning sky. The sounds around him began to change as well. The noise of the city's traffic seemed to soften, to recede. A new sound began to assert itself: the distant, melodic chime of church bells. Somewhere in the city, a church was ringing for evening service. Its call to prayer, a series of clear, resonant notes that floated across the water, a perfect soundtrack for the dying of the light. The murmur of human voices seemed to grow louder as people gathered on the ancient bridges, pausing their journeys to watch the daily spectacle of the sunset. He could hear their soft chatter, their occasional exclamations of wonder, a gentle communal appreciation of the beauty before them. And then a new element entered the scene, an element of incredible, dynamic life. It started as a few small, dark specks in the sky, then a few more, and then hundreds, and then thousands. The starlings, it was the hour of their great evening gathering. From all over the city, they were converging on the trees of Tiber Island, their chosen roosting place for the night. They did not simply fly to the trees. They first performed their astonishing aerial ballet, a phenomenon known as a Arthur watched, utterly captivated. The vast flock, now numbering in the tens of thousands, moved as one single organism. It was a great, dark, living cloud in the sky, twisting and turning, expanding and contracting with a fluidity that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The cloud would stretch out into a long, thin ribbon, then suddenly contract into a dense, dark ball. It would rise and fall, swerving and swooping, creating incredible, complex, three-dimensional shapes against the backdrop of the painted sky. There was no leader, no choreographer. Each bird was responding to the movements of its 7 nearest neighbors, and from these millions of tiny, local decisions, this magnificent, coherent, and unpredictable dance emerged. It was a perfect example of emergent order, of beautiful, complex patterns arising from simple, underlying rules. He listened to the sound they made. It was not the chirping of individual birds, but a collective, rushing sound, a great, whispering roar, like the sound of a vast, dry river flowing through the air. It was the sound of tens of thousands of pairs of wings beating in unison. He watched as the dark, shape-shifting cloud moved across the colors of the sunset. For a moment, it would be a black, silhouetted mass against the fiery orange, and then it would shift and become a shimmering, textured pattern against the soft pink. The sight and sound of it was one of the most beautiful and mysterious things he had ever witnessed. It was nature's own clockwork, a mechanism far more complex and beautiful than any he could ever hope to build. It was a display of pure, unadulterated life force, a celebration of community, of togetherness, of the deep, instinctual intelligence of the natural world. Arthur sat on his cool stone bench, a small, still, solitary figure, and he felt a sense of awe that was so profound it bordered on a religious experience. The grand, historical view from the hilltop had spoken to his mind, to his sense of human time and legacy. This view, the view of the flowing river and the dancing starlings against the canvas of the setting sun, spoke directly to his soul. It spoke of a time that was deeper than human history, the time of the earth, of the seasons, of the rising and setting of the sun, of the ancient migratory patterns of life. He thought of the river flowing endlessly before him. It had been flowing here long before the first human settlement had been built on its banks. It had seen the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, the coming of the popes, the birth of the modern nation. It had carried the reflections of a million sunsets on its surface. It was the ultimate symbol of time, not the fragmented, measured time of a clock, but the continuous, seamless, and eternal flow of existence. He felt his own small, personal sense of time, his grief, his loneliness, his feeling of being stuck, simply dissolve into this greater flow. It was like pouring a cup of salty water into the ocean. His own sorrow was still there, but it was now diluted in something so vast that it lost its sharp, painful taste. He was no longer a boat adrift on a still sea. He was a single drop of water in a great, flowing river, a part of its endless journey. The feeling was one of profound release, of deep and lasting peace. The sky continued to darken. The last sliver of the sun's disk disappeared below the horizon. The brilliant colors faded, leaving behind the deep, soft purple of twilight. The murmuration of the starlings ended as abruptly as it had begun. The great cloud seemed to collapse in on itself, pouring like a dark, liquid waterfall into the thick leaves of the trees on the island. A great, chaotic, chattering sound arose from the trees as the birds settled down for the night, and then, gradually, that too faded into a gentle, sleepy murmur. The show was over. The first bright stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The street lamps along the river and on the bridges now cast a warm yellow glow, their lights reflecting in long, wavering lines on the dark surface of the water. The city had put on its evening jewels. Arthur remained on the bench. The air was cool now, and he zipped up his simple gray jacket, the sound of the zipper loud in the growing quiet. He did not feel cold. He felt a deep sense of calm, of stillness. The frantic, questioning voice in his head, the voice that had been asking what now, for months, had finally gone silent. There was no question. There was only this. The cool air, the dark water, the quiet stars, the gentle hum of the city at night. It was enough. After a long while, he felt it was time to go. It was not a feeling of restlessness, but one of completion. He had completed his journey. He had walked through the city's history, through its living heart, and had arrived at its timeless soul. Now, he felt a quiet desire for his own space, for the simple comfort of his own four walls. He stood up, his body feeling rested and calm. He took one last look at the dark river, a silent thank you for its deep, quiet lesson. He began the walk home. The streets were quieter now, emptier. The shops were closed, their windows dark. The restaurants were full, their warm light and happy sounds spilling out onto the sidewalks. He walked through the pools of yellow light cast by the street lamps, his shadow a long, faithful companion. The walk did not feel lonely. He felt the quiet presence of the city all around him, the thousands of other lives being lived behind the dark windows. He was a part of it, a single, quiet thread in its vast nocturnal tapestry. He arrived at his own building. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the familiar, quiet stairwell. He climbed the 3 flights of stairs, his steps slow and steady, his hand on the cool metal railing. He reached his own front door, took the key from his pocket, and let himself in. He closed the door behind him, and the sounds of the city disappeared, replaced by the soft, welcoming silence of his own home. He did not turn on the main overhead light. He walked over to a small table and switched on a single, small lamp with a warm fabric shade. It cast a gentle golden glow over the room, a light that was soft and kind. He stood for a moment in the center of the room, his home. It was no longer a place of heavy, empty silence. It was a shelter. It was a haven. It was his cabin, his small, safe refuge from the vastness of the world. The worn leather armchair, the dark wooden bookshelf filled with old books, the small, simple table, they were not just objects. They were the familiar, comforting presences of his own life. He walked over to the armchair. He sat down, the leather sighing softly as it took his weight. He did not turn on the radio or pick up a book. He simply sat. He sat in the warm, gentle lamplight, in the quiet of his own small home. He could hear the faint, distant hum of the city outside, a reminder of the great, living world he was a part of. But here, in his cabin, he was safe. He was at peace. His long walk was over. He had journeyed through the heart of time, and it had led him back to himself, back to a place where he could finally, truly rest. He leaned his head back against the worn leather of the chair, and as his breathing became slow and deep and even, he closed his eyes.